Welcome to tonight's program, The American House, from Simple Shelter to Sublime Style. Let me tell you a bit about our presenter. Joe is an architect, art commentator, and Glencoe resident. He returned to the Midwest after 40 years on the West Coast, where he participated in over 500 construction and design projects around the globe. His project lists includes the Los Angeles Biltmore Hotel Historic Preservation, the new FAA air traffic control towers at O'Hare and LAX airports, the new Los Angeles County and USC Medical Center, the Santa Barbara Cottage Hospital Replacement Program, and the UNICAL Service Station of the Future program. Joe also writes design articles in trade publications, short fiction, commentary on contemporary design through his LinkedIn series Midwest Modernism Now, and about personal communication skills at his website, theheadandtheheart.org. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation. Joe, thank you so much for getting started.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, folks, it's great to see you. What a good-looking crowd. Oh, my God. I think you were all Phi Beta Kappa, right? I'm pretty sure about that. All right, let's begin. Good evening, and thanks so much for attending this new two-part lecture series on the history of the single-family American home. Once again, I am pleased to appear at the Glencoe Public Library, one of my favorite spaces. In fact, this is one of the reasons why I moved to Glencoe. I want to thank Grace Hayek, who you just saw, and Natalie Brotman there, and their GPL colleagues for enabling me to provide this show here and now. There will be, as mentioned, a short time at the end of my formal remarks for questions, comments, and discussion. The United States is the only country in the world where the vast majority of people own and live in their own houses, the majority of these being detached single-family houses. Blessed with seemingly unlimited land, an ever-rising tide of beneficial technology, and an innate cultural need to live in one's own part of the American dream. According to scholars, over 63.6% of Americans currently live in single-family homes, generally on individual plots of land. How this result, unprecedented in human history and unrivaled anywhere around the earth, came about is a long, complicated tale. From the late 1600s on, it proceeds from ancient North American indigenous antecedents through over 3 centuries of growth and a multitude of architectural styles, progressing from native cultures to colonial times, through the Victorian era, the Gilded Age, turn of the 20th century, to unique American styles, interwar and post-war modernist movements and beyond. Due to burgeoning demand for massive immigration and increasing prosperity, at first for the wealthy few, but later for a dominant middle class, enabled by Western expansion across a huge continent and rapid technological advance for most citizens, the U.S. has provided a form of basic human shelter unique in world history. This presentation today will explore that miraculous achievement, but only part of it. Up to 1900. And as Frank L. Baum said, there's no place like home. All right. Who was here before us? Ancient antecedents. All right, as you can see, there were tons of different groups, different civilizations, tribes, all across North America when the colonists showed up. Many tribes, but most importantly, many terrains. And because of this, many different types of shelter occurred. All right, let's look at a few of them. What the land provides. Starting on the East Coast with predominantly woodlands, there was lots of wood and bark available, and so we get things like the longhouses of the Iroquois, where they, there you go. They took pieces of trees, bent them over to make a basket-like structure upside down, overlapped bark from trees, especially elm trees, and other grasses and so on, and created these long structures where whole tribes or whole families could huddle together in a collective effort. They would create these thatch partitions for some privacy and a lot of different platforms for people to sleep and store things and so on. And this worked very well for that type of society. Then, as we move elsewhere across the continent, getting to the Great Plains, for example, where there aren't a lot of forests, but there is a lot of grass and a lot of roaming buffalo at that time. And so, of course, we have the native tribes there hunting the bison for both food and for other uses like the hides. And we have, of course, the classic teepee, the first mobile home, as I call it, where they would start at three initial poles stuck into the ground, forming a tripod, and then add additional poles and eventually drape hides both inside and outside the structure. They could also add other things like additional things from the earth, saplings and brush and so on around it in really cold weather. They would use flaps to direct smoke from their fires up and out and so forth, put together with wooden pins to kind of lace it all together. And the beauty of this is it was easy to set up, and then when you needed to move, it was easy to take down. And so it really was the perfect structure for this type of terrain. Continuing. A Navajo writing song, by the way. Okay, so we go to the Southwest, and of course now the very earth itself was being used to create dwellings along with the prodigious grass. And of course we have the so-called adobe buildings. Now what is adobe exactly? Well, it's a composition of clay, sand, water, and some organic binder like straw or grass, which is somewhat crack resistant. And this created both adobe rough bricks that could be built up, and then you could also slather over a plaster-like adobe on top of it to fully kind of make it weatherproof. And so this turned out to be really the perfect structure in many ways for those kinds of weather conditions there. And even just grass could be used, like in Wichita there for the grass house, to create a teepee-like structure, again, using what the land provided. All right. Now the guys from the old world show up. And of course, as we all learned in grade school, we had the 13 colonies and people in their lovely clothes. These are Williamsburg recreators there having a little celebration. And this is one thing I want to talk about today, because one thing I've learned from really looking at how houses have changed over time is the whole concept of private life. And one book that you can go back to, which has been around for a while, is Bill Bryson's book from 2010, At Home, A Short History of Private Life. And he kind of researches from the Middle Ages onward whether there was any private life and how it finally occurred. In colonial America, the middle class was basically about 30 to 40% of the population, consisting of small farmers, artisans, merchants, and professionals, and they could build houses for themselves. Of course, the majority of people during this time were either indentured servants, slaves, or lower class laborers, and then there was the small elite of landowners and gentry. But the rise of the middle class during this period, which was influenced by the growth of trade, commerce, and small-scale farming, started to focus on increasing levels of privacy. As Bryson said, in ancient times, people lived in shared spaces basically with little or no privacy. But then in the 17th and 18th centuries, private rooms like bedrooms and studies became common as people valued personal space in their home. And eventually, of course, we have inventions like indoor plumbing and electricity, which helped to create private spaces like bathrooms and bedrooms. So we have houses becoming combinations of rooms dedicated to specific activities, eventually defining one major difference, public and private spaces within the same house. And then as law and culture progressed, cultural norms developed to protect this personal space. Although what's interesting is where we are today with the new kind of invasive technologies like telephones and cameras and computer assistants and things like that. Although privacy has evolved to be very strong in our culture, now we have modern technology that is somewhat complicating it, which is kind of interesting. All right. So emerging trends at the time, middle class wealth that was beginning to accumulate, the need for privacy, as I said. And let's go back to one of the very original settlements, Jamestown. Started in 1606. It lasted, it was actually the capital of the Virginia colony for several decades until it was finally abandoned in 1619 when the capital moved to Williamsburg, stayed there. And you can see there's this wooden stockade and then all these little buildings inside, many of them being little, private shelters. And this was actually not that much different from what the Native Americans were doing. These are little buildings made out of wattle and daub, basically mud and grass, So they were just really doing what they saw around them. And then eventually, as the colonies prospered and more immigration occurred and so on, then we have more sophisticated buildings beginning to appear. The other thing too is, of course, in the colonies, we had people congregating in the first true urban areas, although by our standpoint, they were very small. The largest one in the colonies was Philadelphia, which was only about 40,000 people. Then New York, 25,000, Boston, 15, Charleston, 12, and Newport, Rhode Island, 11. So it was a pretty small group of people in each place. The whole 13 colonies were about 2.5 million people at the time of the Revolution. We talk about urban planners today, Dudley. The 15-minute city, that's kind of a cool thing. We want to get back to that. Well, these were all 15-minute cities in those days because the only way you could get around was on your own two legs or using animals like horses and oxen, or of course, if you're on a river, by boat. And as you can see from this plan by Ben Franklin for the city of Philadelphia in 1776, it was a true 15-minute city. Within less than a mile, you could basically accommodate all your needs. All right. So, the American house itself, shelter and sustenance. So the original houses, the very early ones, which we'll see in a moment, really didn't have a lot of rooms. And in fact, one of the major rooms was sort of in the center around the fireplace, which was used for cooking, gathering, eating, all kinds of things. And of course, the fireplace was also the cooking area, and you would just suspend the pot and cook the stew for the evening. And you cooked what was available at the time, like Indian corn or brown bread, or, the wildlife you could catch, like geese and that kind of thing. Another very interesting thing I learned about the colonies was the role of alcohol. Did you know that in colonial America, people drank an average of twice the amount of alcohol that people drink today? For example, in 1790, Americans drank an average of 5.8 gallons of pure alcohol per person per year. That would be roughly 34 gallons of beer and hard cider, 5 gallons of distilled spirits, usually rum coming from the West Indies, the Caribbean, and 1 gallon of wine per person per year. Now, it was consumed at almost every meal and social occasion. So I have to think that the colonists were kind of sloshed a lot of the time. I don't know, maybe that's why they declared the revolution. Who knows, after drinking a little bit. But the real reason why they did this, among other things, is that they didn't trust water supply. Because the water they could get from rivers and so on was kind of iffy, whereas alcoholic beverages, killed the bad stuff, and so you could still get your water in the alcohol. So it's kind of interesting to see how much people drank. And this included children, by the way. And of course, here is TJ taking a tipple at night. Little Thomas Jefferson there taking a little evening draught. All right. All right, but buildings, the buildings. All right, starting in New England. So we all know the New England salt box. Here are two classic ones by two U.S. presidents. On the right, in 1681, was the birthplace of John Adams. And then his son, John Quincy Adams, was born and lived in the salt box to the left, 1716. Of course, these are still there today. It's the classic New England box type dwelling with the long roof coming down in back. And then continuing on that kind of thing, here's Paul Revere's house, still existing in the north end of Boston, 1680. This is pretty classic colonial stuff from the Northeast, with everything made out of wood, of course, the shingles on the roof, and the rough siding and that kind of thing. One thing I'm going to do during this lecture is refer to some very nice illustrations from a book I like called American House Styles by an architect named John Milne Baker. And in it, he took a prototypical 44 by 32 inch floor plan and he projected it through every single American house style he could think of. Here are some early ones, the New England one on the left, and then a little bit more sophisticated Georgian one that was somewhat after the first before 1715, the other after. And you can see how things are getting a little bit more complicated. All right, so how were the houses built? Well, this was before machinery. And in a way, just like indigenous peoples, they pretty much had to do it very similar. Here's a good illustration of a simple house at the time, the heavy-duty timber. And what's really important here is to understand how the fastening happened. The mortise and tenon concept was used all the time because there was no other way of really connecting these two pieces securely, the post and the beam. So the pins were actually wood. Why? Oh, and there's the type of window, of course, with handmade wooden frames. Glazing was kind of a luxury item that was often imported. Sometimes shutters were used for climate control and so on. But the thing I want to talk about a little bit more is the whole concept of nails. Nails. Metal nails originally were made by blacksmiths, and they were, in many ways, in terms of cost and scarcity, they were somewhat like jewelry. There just wasn't a lot of them around. It was only until the early 1800s, with the invention of the cut nail machine, that you could get cut nails made by steam-powered or water-powered machines, and so suddenly nails became down in price and somewhat ubiquitous. And towards the end of the century, the creation of wire nail machines became the ultimate standard, and now you really had as many nails as you needed at a reasonable price. But until then, you had to use the wood connections or you had to pay a lot. All right. So we talked about the original New England work and then morphing into the Georgian style for the first part of the 1700s. Larger, more refined dwellings began with symmetrical facades and plans, flat roofs, brick walls, and some delicate classical ornamentation with some porticos being added. So you can see here a Georgian style house. And then after the Revolution, we started morphing into the federal style, which was even more stately, often 3 stories, and typically with flatter roofs. You see the widow walk up there. It's a much more elegant solution, and everything is very logical, because remember, this was the age of enlightenment. So things were meant to be very balanced and very thoughtful. And of course, one example of that is the White House, done by an Irish architect named James Hoban from 1792 to 1800. And we have the 2 classic types of portico. We have the true neoclassical temple front portico on the north side, and then we have the south semicircular portico added just a few years later, the first in 1824, the second in 1829, in the Palladian neoclassical style. And speaking of neoclassical, let's talk about that. So from 1750 to 1850, neoclassical architecture really did predominate in the United States. Now, why was this? Well, it was a reaction against the prevailing European Baroque and Rococo styles, which were very kind of complicated and very showy and that kind of thing. It was kind of reflecting, as I said earlier, the age of enlightenment where logic was really favored. And it represents, especially for America, our thought of ourselves as a new republic like ancient Rome. And so, of course, we would tend to embrace the kinds of aesthetics that the Romans did, or the Greeks before them. And then you have the Renaissance theories reinforcing this, especially the 4 books on architecture by Andrea Palladio. Now, even though he originally published it in the 1500s, it was finally translated to English in 1738, just in time for the colonists to be influenced by it. And of course, you know, again, a very logical thing. Here's the famous Villa Rotunda in Vicenza, Italy. And oh, by the way, just as an aside, this is my wedding cake from 1977 in Oak Park, Illinois, from my first marriage. And by the way, I got married in Unity Temple, Oak Park's, you know, Frank Lloyd Wright's Unity Temple. But I digress. So anyway, the whole concept of logic being the font of beauty, and of course, being ruled by the orders of columns and tablatures and so on, the classical architectural orders like the Doric, right here, the most, sorry. Yeah. Like the Doric right here, the more severe one, and then the more elegant Ionic, Corinthian, and then different combination versions like the Etruscan, Tuscan one, and so on. And so the whole concept of the temple front as being the main entry, of course, became the dominant element of this type of design. And very symmetrical. There was a use of masonry and somewhat minimal wooden ornament, but what was used was very particular in terms of what you should do. Another famous dwelling, we all know about this one, 1772, Monticello by Thomas Jefferson in Virginia. And there we have the classic temple front. Now, here's an interesting thing. I realized that housing also reflected the culture around it. And a very interesting thing happened around the turn of the 19th century. With the Napoleonic era in Europe, fashions changed. Suddenly, women were wearing, when they dressed up, the empire style of fashion, which consisted of high fitted bodices with a low neckline and short sleeves, but a long, full, and often flared dress, lightweight, sheer, and often white, typically made out of fine bleached cotton or fine linen. And you can see how elegant and abstract it is. It's really amazing when you realize what happened after this later on in the century. And we'll see this time and time again. When fashions change, architectural styles change, and vice versa. So 1800, 1820, the Age of Enlightenment, the Empire style. All right, the Young Republic enters a new century. And of course, it was manifest destiny, our destiny being very clear to everyone. We were moving across the continent. Now, when I use that term, I must admit, although it was invented in 1845 by newspaper editor John O'Sullivan, but it, of course, has been condemned, and I believe rightly so since then, for advocating Native American genocide. So, what can you say? But anyway, there was a whole continent to settle, and you can see how the U.S. grew from the early colonies through the first part east of the Mississippi, then with the Louisiana Purchase, the Texas annexation, Florida, the Mexican cession, Oregon, Gadsden, and so on, eventually coast to coast. And towards the end of the century, Alaska being acquired in 67 and Hawaii annexed in 98. And there was a population explosion. At the turn of the century, there were 5 million people in the United States, but by the end of the century, there were 76 million people in the United States. So people kept coming, and they kept coming. And then, of course, we had the whole concept of technological advance. First, transportation. First, we had the canal age, and then obviously the age of rail that we'll talk about in a moment. The roads had come in my next lecture in the 20th century, and so forth. And also communication. Of course, we had newspapers and magazines, but with the telegraph in 1840, just like the railroad, the continent could be connected from edge to edge. And eventually we'd have the telephone in 76, and in the next century, radio and TV. So, tremendous growth, tremendous. And what happened because of this growth? Demand for housing. Now let's talk about railroads.
They started in the east, laying down the rails, and out in California they were blazing out a trail. Toward the center they did strive, no one knew when they would arrive, building the transcontinental railroad. They cleared the way and blasted through the mountainside, and built big trestle bridges stretching over valleys wide. And it's a fact they laid more than 3,000 miles of track to build the transcontinental railroad. Took 6 years, and in the spring of 1869, in Promontory, Utah, they connected the two lines. And across this growing nation, folks joined in the celebration of the Transcontinental Railroad. And across this growing nation, folks joined in the celebration of the Transcontinental Railroad.
So from just a few miles in the 1830s to 250,000 miles after the turn of the 20th century, railroads was the glue that made it all happen. All right, back to how things were built. So we talked about the early version of heavy timber framing with wooden connections and so on, but things changed. In the 1930s, someone invented a better way of framing houses. Now, there is some dispute as to who did it. Some people feel that George Washington Snow in Chicago, who was a carpenter, in creating a warehouse here, created the first balloon frame, as it's called, in 1932. Other people think it was done by other people in other places. Regardless, in the 1930s, this happened. And, sorry, let me get to the point. All right. So it was a simplified method of construction that used inexpensive uniform lumber, now 2x4s and 2x6s and so on, and nails, only this time metal nails, which were now reasonably priced, to create strong, lightweight frames. The method was quick and easy to build and only required basic carpentry skills. It became very popular in the United States, and aided and abetted by the railroads, it was basically shipped all over the country. It allowed for rapid construction of homes and other buildings and helped to improve shelter options even for poorer North Americans. Now, it was eventually succeeded by a variation on a theme, the platform frame. As you can see the difference, the balloon frame has the wall studs go all the way up from top to bottom, from the foundation all the way up to the roof. But platform framing built it one story at a time. So you would build the first platform and then start again on the second and so forth. That was somewhat easier to do. And so platform framing more or less supplanted balloon framing, although to be honest, balloon framing has never really totally gone out of style in the United States. And of course, once again, there's the miracle connector, nails, that now were reasonably available to everyone. All right, so turning to environmental control, like indigenous peoples, originally, for a while, colonist houses and people moving across the U.S. would build houses that simply have fireplaces. Lots and lots of fireplaces. In fact, more or less one in every room. You can see that in Thomas Jefferson's house here in Virginia that he built for someone. And you can see that in each room there's a fireplace. So you could heat that space alone by that fireplace and so on. Then eventually, around the 1840s, we had the iron stove, a better way of heating. So you still had a fireplace, but it was enclosed in an iron box, and you even had a nice top to cook on and that kind of thing. So that became the most common form of heating. And then even after that, around the 1880s and beyond, we had the appearance of the central furnace that would be more and more like what we experience today, with metal box ducts or piping to radiators, common, bringing the heat all around the house to all the rooms. So you only really needed one central location again of heat, but it could be transferred all over the house. Now, we talked about neoclassical aesthetics as being the dominant force in the early part of the 19th century. But another movement arose, Romanticism, which supplanted neoclassicism in America after the middle part of the century. Basically, American Romanticism at first was a literary, artistic, and philosophical movement that took place from the 20s to the 60s. And it did begin in Europe, but it really became very strong in the United States as a reaction against the strict beliefs of the Puritans and others in the Age of Reason. And it celebrated individualism, nature, and the imagination over reason. So it also explained the importance of personal freedom and self-expression. As we know, there were key authors in this movement, such as the poetess Emily Dickinson, the essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson, novelist Edgar Allan Poe, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, and my personal favorite, poet Walt Whitman. The American Romantic period featured literature that celebrated the American landscape and reacted against the industrialized landscape, reacting to the negative effects of it by bringing people back to nature and simplicity, truth, and beauty. So it sought to define a uniquely American national identity, separate from Europe, and also created awareness of injustices like slavery and other types of things needing social reform. And here, of course, is a young Walt Whitman.
I celebrate myself, and what I assume, you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. I life and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass.
Of course, Walt Whitman was a very interesting character, built born in somewhat straitened circumstances in New York. He grew up in a working class family, really had virtually no formal education, worked a lot of different jobs in his life, including teacher and printer and journalist. And of course, he was writing poems, and he eventually started collecting them. The first collection, which he would call Leaves of Grass, came out in 1855. Eventually, he would have almost 200 poems in that collection in 6 to 9 editions, depending upon what you consider an edition. And it really expressed his themes of individualism and democracy, nature, and the human experience, all using free verse, a different kind of poetic experience. Of course, he was a strong advocate for the abolition of slavery and human equality. And eventually he did live in Washington, D.C. and was a government clerk towards the end of his life. He died in 1892 in Camden, New Jersey. And I just love this guy. I think he's such a cool guy. If I could be somebody instead of myself, I'd be him. All right. What about architecture? So Romanticism in architecture is characterized by a desire to evoke a sense of the past and a connection to nature. The most common Romantic styles in the United States were Greek Revival, Gothic Revival, and Italianate. Other styles included various exotic revivals, which incorporated elements from various cultures, such as Egyptian, Asian, or Swiss. It often included asymmetrical designs, totally different from the balanced, simple, neoclassical, Georgian federal type things we talked about earlier. Asymmetrical designs, heavy vaulted ceilings, pointed spires, and picturesque landscapes. It was a reaction to the Industrial Revolution and neoclassicism. It was a way for Americans to express their individualism and to reconnect with nature and the beauty of the natural world. And as I said, it ended up with multiple variations as the U.S. grew, and there were many different types of people doing many different types of things. All right. Now, along this time, around the same time, we had another element that really influenced the demand and supply of houses. We had the emergence of writers that wrote about houses and informed the public about what houses could be like or should be like. Among these were two people in particular. There is Andrew Jackson Downing on the left and Alexander Jackson Davis on the right. Downing in particular wrote a bunch of interesting books that became very popular, both as house manuals, how to do it for builders, and pattern books for the public. What do I want? And so you can see some of his publications, such as The Architecture of Public Houses, in 1850, and Cottage Residences, or a series of designs for rural cottages and cottage villas, in 1852. And you can see some excerpts from these where you could see both the plan and the illustration of what a house should look like, whether it was Gothic on the left or Italianate on the right. In some ways, really the same house, but the enclosure was quite a bit different. Meanwhile, Davis was doing similar things. Here's of course, you saw this in the ad. Here's the beautiful wood, red wood cottage in Woodstock, Connecticut by Downing in the 1840s. And in contrast to that, another Gothic revival at a massive scale, Lyndhurst, on the Lyndhurst estate in Tarrytown, New York, a 67-acre property eventually owned by the robber baron Jay Gould. And that's actually been the site for a lot of different movies and novels and things like that, named, by the way, after the linden trees that were on the site. Anyway, so you can see that small or large, this was a very, very romantic and picturesque type approach. And people demanded it because they had read about it. There we go. All right. After the War of 1812, the Civil War was actually a pretty nice period in the United States. Scholars have called it the era of good feeling, when there was national unity and political harmony. And during this time, people felt free to engage in a lot of these different revival styles, aided and abetted by Western expansion and, of course, the railroads coming to your town, so to speak. We've talked about neoclassical. Here's a little later version of it, the Greek Revival in the 20s and 30s and 40s, again with the prototypical portico, temple front. In contrast, the Gothic Revival with the beautiful filigree on the barge boards and balconies and just little coverings over windows and things. It allowed carpenters to have a lot of fun. All right. Once again, another Greek Revival, the Wynn House in Columbus, Georgia, versus Gothic Revival, the Mann House in Newport, Rhode Island. As I said earlier, this is the difference of logic versus emotion. So you can see the two approaches, which are both good, I mean, both valid, but they lead to very different appearances in dwellings. All right. And then after the Civil War, we have even more different types of style. You have the Italianate style, kind of, in a sense, replicating a country villa from Italy. And then the Second Empire, kind of simulating some of the things going on in France in the middle period of the century, the beginnings of all the wonderful mansard roofs that we see on these types of buildings. And here's a couple of historical buildings that are kind of fun to talk about. This is Springwood in Hyde Park, New York. This is Franklin Delano Roosevelt's home in the Federal style at first, and then eventually upgraded to the Italianate style. Whoops, sorry, I want to go back. There we go. And then to the right, Harry Truman's house in Independence, Missouri. And of course, in the Gothic Revival style. So again, you know, you picture thing and you go in that direction. All right. And then we have more Second Empire here with the beautiful. Oh, sorry. There we go. Second Empire on the left, and then on the right, one of my favorite houses, Mark Twain's house in Connecticut. And it always reminds me of a steamboat for some reason. I don't know. I just love the whole kind of excess of it. All right. And then there were the people that did other things. Some in part and some in whole. Like, for example, this is a Greek Revival house, but if you look very closely, there are at the top these Egyptian little kind of papyrus capitals for the columns. So you have little unusual influences creeping in. The architect's unknown for that. It's the Gable House in Richmond, Virginia. And then probably an even more exotic, the house called Olana in the Moorish, what was called the Moorish style in those days in Hudson, New York. This was Galvard Vaux, the architect. We'll hear more about him later, for the painter Frederick S. Church. And this polychrome kind of beautiful decoration of otherwise fairly basic services really gives it a pop that is so nice. All right. Now here's a fun little segue, a little bit different. The octagon, an ode to 8 exterior walls. There was a man, kind of a self-styled polymath called Orson Fowler, who wrote a book in 1849. He was a designer, phrenologist, lecturer, writer, kind of a jack of all trades. And he wrote this book called The Octagon House, A Home for All, advocating for 8-sided houses. And here's one of the houses that he did. It's the rich twin octagon house in Akron, New York. And this really engaged a certain subset of people, and some of the variations on it were really quite astounding. Here is the Longwood House in Natchez, Mississippi by Samuel Sloan architect. And not only are there 8 sides, but each side has pushed out with all kinds of balconies and porticos and things like that in this beautiful tower. So it just really celebrated the 8-sided thing. All right. And then, of course, a totally different approach. H.H. Richardson and his Romanesque style, late medieval, and this heavy kind of stone architecture. Of course, you recognize this, I'm sure, as the Glessner House on the south side of Chicago from 1885. And it has this very famous archway, which would be influence a lot of different architects, even Frank Lloyd Wright. And then the interior had this wonderful kind of masculine kind of heaviness of wood and darkness, and it was just kind of a cool house. All right, and then we get to the Victorian age. So Queen Victoria was the Queen of England for 62 years, from 1837 to 1910. And sort of the middle part of this was considered the Victorian era. This was an era of a lot of contradicting things going on. There was urbanization and various kind of reactions against urbanization, aestheticism, and of course, in the United States, we talked about Western expansion, Reconstruction, social reform, and so on, the Gilded Age, lots of immigration, literature, science and tech. And underlying all of this was this Victorian morality with a strong focus on strict moral codes and family values. This is one of my favorite paintings of Edward Hopper, 1925, the house by the railroad in a Second Empire Victorian style, and yet next to this modern railroad track, the two classic symbols of that time. Many styles, Second Empire, stick, Queen Anne, Richardsonian, Romanesque, shingle, and so forth. Now, remember we talked about the Empire style at the beginning around 1800? Well, look what happened. Now people are back to wearing women especially, very heavy clothing, lots of constrictive clothing with corsets and many layers of dress and even bustles and things like that. And so suddenly it's the freedom that was celebrated at the beginning of the century wasn't quite there for a while, I think. A formal yet eclectic time. And we all know this house, the Second Empire style Gurney house, the oldest house in Glencoe, Illinois, 1869. And it's still there. A really cool little house with the beautiful, very vertical mansards. And Gurney is kind of an interesting guy. He was mayor of Chicago for a while. He did many of things. This was his country house. Right across the street, as you know, are the train tracks, and he was the president of a railroad. And so he would come up here right from the train station, and his house would be right there. So pretty classic Victorian style dwelling. And interiors. So there's, overdressed probably symbolizes what we're seeing here. It's just a different culture, just stuffing interiors with everything, high ceilings and sweeping staircases, arches, and ornate fireplace mantles, lots of plaster molding and wainscoting and all kinds of wallpaper. And also a lot of closed off floor plans with lots of small rooms, many more than in the past, because these large places had servants. And so we had butlers' pantries and servants' quarters and that kind of thing. So in terms of privacy, there was lots and lots of places for it. And not quite our style, but certainly impressive nevertheless. Okay, and then kind of summarizing the Victorian era, I consider the Queen Anne style to be the one I would point to, 1880 to 1910. And again, here's one of Baker's illustrations of that. So the Queen Anne style, often associated with the Victorian era, very asymmetrical with uneven, irregular facades, lots of variety and movement, lots of projections such as bay windows, turrets, and many other things, giving it a more dynamic appearance. Here's a real one. Simon Sherwood House in Fairfield, Connecticut. Roofs were often steeply pitched and may feature gables and dormers and towers. Very complex with multiple angles and varied shapes like hipped or gable or mansard roofs. And a lot of ornate woodwork, including detailed wooden trim and decorative elements like spindles, brackets, and carved panels. This is kind of a cool one, be a nice thing for the weekend. This is Craigside at Manchester by the Sea, Massachusetts, by Peabody and Stern Architects. It looks like the classic setting for a romance, right? A bodice-ripping romance. And then kind of summing it all up, here's another painting. This is a Norman Rockwell painting from 1967 called Stockbridge, Main Street at Christmas. Of course, this is Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And the beauty of this is you have all these various housing styles that we've been talking about, like the kind of Victorian stuff, but then some of the earlier sort of neoclassical, different things in between. And it forms a really pleasing and interesting whole, which is what I like about the fact that there were many different revival styles. By the way, just as a little aside, that's why I like Glencoe, because there are all these different little revival things in Glencoe that are so cool to see. But anyway, I digress. Yeah, hopefully we won't build too many black and white houses, but that's another story. All right, stick style, 1860 to 1890. So this was the apotheosis of wood articulation on the outside and indeed inside of a house. This is the John Griswold House in Newport, Rhode Island, by Richard Morris Hunt, architect, who was sort of the architect to the stars, by the way. You'll see that in a moment. So you can see that we have this layering of a kind of a grid-like decoration contrasting with the panels in between, two different colors, really emphasizing that, even the beautiful pattern on the roofing. And it was just such a cool demonstration of what you could do with carpentry. And even on the inside, you can see he's continuing this sort of celebration of woodwork. You have the faux sky peeking through the woodwork above, and then the maca tree on the floor, and the beautiful mantelpiece at the fireplace. So, I mean, this was really the height of craftsmanship. The massing of forces and the forging of masses. All right, the robber barons, the Gilded Age, the leisure class, conspicuous consumption. We talked about Richard Morris Hunt earlier. Here's the Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, the classic summer cottage, quote unquote, for Cornelius Vanderbilt II, in the Italian palazzo style by Hunt. And in 1899, the theorist Thorstein Veblen wrote his famous book, The Theory of the Leisure Class, and he invented the concept of conspicuous consumption. And as he said in the book, conspicuous consumption of valuable goods is a means of reputability to the gentleman of leisure. In other words, if you've got it, flaunt it. So that leads us to the largest house in America. Still true today. We all know what this is, right? The French chateau-esque style of the Biltmore in Asheville, North Carolina, for George W. Vanderbilt, their railroads and steamboat magnate. This house has 1,178,926 square feet, including 250 rooms, with 35 bedrooms and 43 bathrooms. Yeah, it's a big house.
And an indoor swimming pool.
And an indoor swimming pool. Thank you, sir. Now, so we've talked about individual dwellings, but how do they congregate together? How do they form communities? Well, one interesting thing began to happen as not only did we have railroads reaching out, but we also had different types of railed conveyances. And we had railway suburbs appearing, like in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Brooklyn, Rhode Island, Cleveland, Ohio, and Chicago, Illinois. And then we had the first planned suburb in 1868 in Riverside, Illinois. You know, it's amazing how many firsts happen in the Chicago area when you think about it all these times. But anyway. So here we have the plan, the original plan of Riverside, Illinois. So there was a group of people, the Riverside Improvement Company, that bought 1,600 acres of land along the Des Plaines River and along the right-of-way of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. And they hired Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux to design the community. The goal was to create a community where residents could live in harmony with nature while still having access to modern conveniences, and of course also be able to go into the city to important jobs. The plan was to create a suburban oasis, a third space, if you will, between the city and country, that contrasted with the grid of Chicago, the rectilinear grid we all know, which of course a few years later would be largely destroyed by the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. This particular design included curving streets designed to follow the natural contours of the land and the Des Plaines River, lots of parks and commons, more than a third of the land in those, with setbacks to create a sense of open space, and the presence of a number of different famous architects creating dwellings there, such as Frank Lloyd Wright and William LeBaron Jennings. And of course, as I said, you could go right there to the train station in downtown Riverside and go into the city. And that, by the way, is the Riverside Water Tower in the back today. I'll have a lot more to talk about suburbs in part 2. All right. And also, although, you notice that I'm doing a lot of different topics today because they're all intertwined. And one thing that I really noticed towards the end of this century is how architecture comes of age in America. And by that I mean it was the rise of licensure and the first celebrity architects, or as we call them, starchitects. Basically, we have states beginning to require licensure of architects. And who was the first state? Once again, it was Illinois. Illinois was the first state to require licensure in 1897. The architects there had tried 3 times in the past and failed to get the licensure happening, but the 4th time was a success. The American Institute of Architects was founded a few years before in 1857, and then Illinois was followed by all the other states, such as California in 1901, New Jersey in 2002, and I believe it's New York in 1915. So the idea here was this was an important profession. You needed to have a series of work experiences, education, training, and so on to really be licensed as an architect. And that is, in fact, what I went through in my own career. It's still true today. And it's a good thing because it ensures that the people that are doing these kinds of dwellings more or less know what they're doing, although some people would feel not necessarily true. All right, let's talk about some starchitects. So Richard Morris Hunt, we already talked about doing the big Vanderbilt stuff. And we talked about H.H. Richardson. And now we have Daniel Burnham. Now, even though Daniel Burnham really shouldn't be in this lecture because he didn't really do houses as such, I think he's such a very interesting guy because he was the architect in Chicago for many years. He did many interesting skyscrapers like the Flatiron Building in New York and the Carson Perry Scott Building on State Street, as we all know. He was the director of works for the 1893 Chicago's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, and was instrumental in doing the so-called Plan of Chicago in 1909 to reshape the urban landscape of Chicago with the introduction of parks, boulevards, and a more organized city grid. He believed in the so-called city movement, city beautiful movement. So kind of complementing Riverside, he wanted to make the city more beautiful as well as the suburbs. But the difference here is that he was a strong proponent of Beaux-Arts architecture, going back to neoclassical type things from the past that we talked about earlier. In contrast, and there's McKim, Mead, and White, the dominant architects in New York at the time. In contrast, we have Louis Sullivan. Louis Sullivan was born in Boston in 1856, studied architecture at MIT, and then in Paris at the École des Beaux-Arts. He moved to Chicago in 1873, where he worked for many different firms and eventually partnered with engineer Dankmar Adler. And of course, that firm became the very famous firm in Chicago that mentored Frank Lloyd Wright and others. He, of course, is known for his principle of form follows function, meaning a building design should reflect its purpose. And indeed, another thing that I always find very interesting about him is he was a genius in the design of architectural ornament, which created very natural-looking ornament, sinuous and curvilinear, that was really unlike anything that had been done before. He was, of course, famous for a number of skyscrapers like the Wainwright Building in St. Louis, the Guarantee Building in Buffalo, and the Carson Peary Scott Building in Chicago. Sorry, I thought that was the other guy, but no. He was a mentor to Frank Lloyd Wright. It's kind of sad, though. In his later time, he became less popular, and he eventually died in 1924, essentially broke. So it wasn't a great ending for him, I must say. But his popularity would come back many years later. Here's a very early Prairie style, the James Charnley House. I think you can see this on the north side today. Louis Sullivan, and you can already see the kind of abstraction, the use of his architectural ornament, and interesting things that in the next building we show you would be amazingly similar. But before we get to that building, one more building. So this is the appropriately named Low House in Bristol, Rhode Island by McKim, Mead, and White of New York. And this building does not exist anymore, was demolished several years ago. But it is a classic example of the shingle style, which nobody knew was a style in those days. That term was invented by architectural historian Vincent Scully in his 1949 doctoral dissertation, The Cottage Style. But anyway, the concept of the shingle style was it was kind of a new sense of everything, a new sense of living spaces, a new sense of siting with nature, massing, and of course the surface texture, in this case using lots and lots of shingles, would definitely influence others such as Frank Lloyd Wright in his first home in Oak Park, Illinois, 1889 to 1898. And you can see a very similar feeling between the two with the triangular front all shingled. It's just very interesting the way these styles would eventually morph into other styles. And this period at the turn of the 20th century is an extremely, extremely fruitful period for unique American architecture. We will, of course, go into much more of that in part 2. But wait, I'm not done yet. I can't end without talking about America's greatest living architect, greatest, not living anymore, but he was at the time, Frank Lloyd Wright, born in Richland Center, Wisconsin, 1867, died in 1959 in Phoenix. Brief apprenticeship with Chicago architect Joseph Lyman Silsby, largely self-taught once again. Yes, he did go to the University of Wisconsin, but I think he lasted maybe a semester or two. And then he worked at Adler and Sullivan, and Louis Sullivan took him under his wing, 1888 to 93. He was eventually fired because he was taking all kinds of outside work on the side, not telling them. And then he opened his own practice in Oak Park in 1893. And the Prairie School begins. And remembering the Charnley House, now we have the Winslow House in River Forest, Illinois. 1894. So again, it's actually very similar to the Charnley House in many ways. Now you have this proto-prairie style gathering of the windows underneath the broad eaves. I mean, it's still a little different. You've got some decoration and so on, but it's beginning. And there's the ground plan. And you have this beautiful kind of extension of this dining room area, which I will show you in just a moment. There's the back, which is a lot less symmetrical. And there's that poke out from the dining room, and you can see that the windows are, they have decorative art glass in them. So even before the turn of the century, something very different was happening. It wasn't neoclassical. It wasn't Gothic revival. It wasn't any of those things. It was something new. And for that, we'll have to have another meeting. So tonight we first considered the shelter of antiquity based on what the land provides, then moved on to the first settlements of Western Europeans coming to this continent, the 13 colonies and the new American Republic based on styles from the Old World. But as the nation expanded from one coast to another, abetted by canals, railroads, and the telegraph, a multitude of new styles, increasingly sophisticated, emerged. Most of these adhered to competing aesthetic worldviews, and these generally can be summed up as the classical versus the romantic, or logic dominating versus emotion dominating, the head versus the heart. As millions more participated in the search for shelter, new forms of organizing dwellings into communities on the land began. Thus, we saw the early railroad and streetcar suburbs, a popular middle ground between city and country. And towards the end of the 19th century, a cavalcade of technological wonders happened. Electricity, the telephone, air conditioning, the internal combustion motor car, the airplane, and many other inventions that set the stage for a miraculous era to come. As we have seen, the way people lived was constantly changing. Beliefs and fashions, the relationships of men and women, the natures of work and play, all affected the essential qualities of a home. For example, the concept of privacy, as we talked about earlier, itself changed, and with it the layouts and looks of our primary places, allowing inhabitants better to act out the dramas of their individual lives. And so we have arrived at the dawn of the 20th century, which some have labeled the American century. To explore that time, I will need the second lecture in this series, to be scheduled, The American Home, Part 2, from 1900 to today. So stay tuned. There's a lot more to come. Okay, let's have some feedback. Anybody? Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned in the beginning that 63% of the housing is single-family housing in the U.S. That I find it very hard to. Is this condos or?
No, it is single-family detached housing.
Really?
Yes, I was surprised by that also. It's continued to rise, and it's at that level right now. Yes, ma'am.
Most of the houses you showed seem to be sort of the wealthy people. But as you said, so many people were middle class and so forth. What about houses that had workshops in them or stores and things like that? Did they follow the same patterns?
Well, first of all, a lot of that was urban, and I intentionally didn't want to go into urban dwellings, attached housing, and that kind of thing. And secondly, the real expansion of middle-class housing was in the 20th century. And that's what we'll talk about in part 2. Yeah. Anybody else? Where's Grace?
Probably June, we're thinking, but we'll see.
It's already done, by the way. Already done.
Oh,
So,
I didn't
yeah,
know that.
already. Yes, ma'am.
Earlier on, you showed us several pictures of porticos, and I think there are a lot of words that are similar to porticos. Can you tell me the definition of a portico?
Well, okay. My definition is that you have a shelter, an overhanging roof of some sort, generally supported on 2 or more columns, and that is the portico. Now, sometimes they are cantilevered, but in most traditional houses they are not. They come to 2 to 4 columns, like the White House porticos or the ones you would see, especially the federal style began to really populate those. Yeah. Yeah.
I have to ask, the octagon house, what shape were the rooms?
Yeah.
You know, that's a funny story. It depends upon which octagon house you're talking about. The one on the left, they probably wear odd, a parallelogram type, But the one on the right, I think what they did is, because it was such a large one, they had so many different variations with the poke outs and so on. They had a lot more rectilinear rooms in that one. So they probably had some wasted space and so on. But obviously with an octagon house, there's going to be some very odd shapes. And in part 2, I talk about things like houses by Bruce Goff and so on. You want to see some odd shapes, I'll show you those. Let me tell you. Yes, ma'am.
It's my husband. Talk about the house that we saw designed by Thomas Jefferson. It was not an octagon.
Yes. God, what was the name of that house in Virginia?
Poplar.
The Poplar Heights? Poplar?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was his summer home.
Right.
Yeah, I should have
And
taken
that was a geometric figure, but it wasn't an octagon.
No. I think it might have been
A 5-sided.
something like that.
Yeah.
He was very into geometry, I'll
Right.
tell you that.
And those rooms were all odd shaped. But
Yeah.
then there was a center room that he used as his bedroom.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very pretty house to
it's very
visit. Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. Sorry I don't have pictures of that. But so the themes here are, it is a very odd thing that people in America live in single family houses, almost everybody. How is that when nobody else in the world does that? I can only think that because of the rapid expansion of the civilization, the ability of pre-manufactured parts to allow even small single family houses to be built reasonably economically, and of course eventually the rise of the middle class, which, as I said at the outset, was about 1/3 of the population in the colonies, but would rise to 2/3 of the population in the 1950s and beyond the 80s. One of the problems we're having today is that the middle class has shrunk. A recent chart I saw indicated that the middle class in America now is about 40%, when 30 or 40 years ago it was 60%. So that's one of the reasons, in my view, why we're having a lot of political uncertainty and tumult, because there isn't that glue between the top and the bottom as large as it used to be. In other words, people that have enough wealth that they can support the system, but not so much wealth that they can ignore everybody else, if you know what I mean. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
I grew up in a house that was built in 1898.
Oh, man.
In California. Part of the house was the Montgomery Ward House. Do you remember?
Oh.
Do you know?
Yeah.
It was you mentioned prefix.
Part 2. I'm especially going to talk about Sears. Part 2.
Yes.
That was very early, by the way, very early for Montgomery. Yeah, the very beginning of that.
Yeah. And then I have another question. I always wondered why the salt box house? Why the salt? I never understood why the salt box house was shaped so that they didn't take advantage of the back. I mean, it sloped down in the back. It was high in the front. Why? What was this upstairs? We have some in England. What was the upstairs missing because it had this deep, long back?
I think it was easier to add more space without a whole separate roof structure that only was over a first floor, if you follow me. I mean, they already had the double roof, so they just extended it to add more space in back. That's my opinion. I'd have to research it.
Okay, I thought maybe there wasn't room for 8 rooms in the back because the roof gets quite low compared to.
Well, I'm thinking in the back, it narrows down to a 1-story house. That is true.
Yeah.
So you have kind of 2-story, 1-story. But instead of having one house with a double roof and then a little house below. They just said, well, let's just keep the roof going and cover that. So you had kind of an attic space there in the back. But pretty, though. Anybody else? Okay, well, this is lovely. I'm so glad that you were able to spend this time with me. Appreciate it.